Hey, Sam from Folk of All Trades here. Welcome to our greenhouse. I thought we'd just have a look around here while we're waiting for some people to join us. So this is a fully recycled, repurposed stuff greenhouse. It's pretty decadent. Not everyone needs to have a greenhouse, but it was on our sort of wish list, and so we ended up building it just out of the bits and pieces that didn't go into the house when we built it. And friends gave us the windows, and I was able to salvage the timber, new screws obviously, but yeah, really nice to be able to use all those materials to be able to grow our seedlings. It's one of our favourite places to be, particularly Danny, who's behind the camera. So just a quick overview, we've got a shelving system here that is starting to rust, so we might have to look at a more permanent solution. But as you can see, there is some light coming through from the north, and there's also light coming through the east, and then we've got some polycarb at the top. We didn't go a completely polycarb or glass house because it would get really, really hot in summer, and we actually start lots of our winter seedlings in summer, so we've sort of had to adjust the light levels, make a bit of a compromise, but it works pretty well for us. Some of the plants do sort of head that way, searching for the light, but you know, generally it works pretty well, and we just rotate them. These ones were facing all this way, so I've just rotated them around. The one thing I do want to point out that's maybe a little bit unusual is that we've got some irrigation here. These misters go off twice a day at the moment, even though it's still nice and cool, and they actually go off up to 4 or 5 times a day in summer. It's a really fine mist, and that just keeps everything moist and allows those seeds to germinate, because the last thing you want is to lose your seedlings. So hopefully lots of people have joined us by now, and I'd really love to hear where you're joining us from. So if you could pop those in the comments, and then Daniel know that you're there as well. We'll use that comment function for questions as we go. But what are we here to talk about? We're here to talk about planting seedlings and caring for them. So if you joined us last week, we're doing a bit of a green living series here. We talked about preparing the soil, preparing the beds ready for planting. So feel free to check that out if you haven't seen it yet. This whole series is being supported by the Adelaide and Mount Lofty Ranges Natural Resources Management Board and Resilient South Partnership Council. So that's City of Holdfast Bay, Mitcham, Marion and Onkaparinga. So a big thanks to them. And I also want to acknowledge that I am here on Kaurna land, beautiful Kaurna Yata, and to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and for living here on land that was never seeded. So I'm going to talk about seeds and seedlings first up. We're going to talk about planning. How do you figure out where you're going to put things? We're also going to do a demo of actually putting the seedlings in the ground, watering them in, how to take care of them, and then finally some bits and pieces on weeding and also keeping on top of pests. So let's start off with planning. Really, really important to have a plan, because it's all well and good to have seedlings and then just wander out and stick them somewhere, but you don't want to put them in the wrong place. They're harder to move once they're in place. So we're a big fan of planning. We didn't always do it, but it's a good thing to do. So it looks a bit complicated here, but this is basically a record of stuff that we've done in the past and then also plans for the future. Now, we've got 7 rows, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and the row that we're focusing on today is row 7. So if you joined me last week, you would have seen that I was pulling out tomatoes, which are in the Solanaceae family. It's really useful to know your families, because what I wouldn't want to do is plant something like potatoes following tomatoes, because that's also in the Solanaceae family. And you really don't want to follow the same thing, because then pests and diseases can build up. It exhausts the soil, and so we're actually going to be planting brassicas today. Not necessarily Swedes and turnips, those are just a couple of examples of what's in that family. Today we're going to be planting cabbages in that family, in that row. So how do you even decide what to plant? There are some great resources. This is a really local what to plant when guide, put together by market gardeners, and we've put a link to find this PDF that you can print out yourself or keep it online. We've put a link to that in our event, along with some ideas of where to get seedlings, some other planting guides. There's a few resources in there. So, as I said, we're going to be planting cabbages, and we started these probably about 5 or 6 weeks ago. So they've got their true leaves. They're not just little tiny seedlings that have emerged with, these are the seed leaves, which don't actually, they all look the same pretty much for lots of veggies. And then these are the true leaves where it's actually starting to grow as a proper little plant. How do you tell if it's ready to plant? Well, there's actually some roots coming out the bottom here. So that's a pretty good indication that these are ready to go. You don't really want to let plants get too big in a small cell like this, because basically they'll start to run out of room and they'll stop growing, they'll bonsai themselves. And so you want to get to that point where they're just starting to fill the space, and then you put them in the ground and they can just continue along quite happily. If they stop, then when you put them in the ground, they might take a couple of weeks to get going again, and we don't want that kind of pause to happen. I will just pop one out so that you can actually see the root development on it. Now, really, really important to never damage the stem, because the stem is actually the thing that... oh, I picked up the wrong one. This is the one I wanted to show you. The stem, it cannot regrow. So I'll just squeeze this and loosen it, and then I'll pick it up by its leaves. So popping up there, you can see how there's lots and lots of healthy looking roots, but they're not winding around, they're not choking themselves. So that one's perfect, ready to go. So we'll plant that out in just a minute. The other thing that I want to plant today, which is slightly different, are leeks. And so these are American flag leeks. We really like that one. It grows quite large. And those were sugarloaf cabbages, if you're interested. So these ones, you don't need to be so careful with the roots. You can just sort of pull the whole things out. It's all leaf. There's not really a stem when it comes to leeks. So I'm just going to pull a couple out. I don't want to take this whole tray. I'm just going to pull a couple out for us to plant. Pop them on this planting plate. And you'll notice here that these are actually multi-sown, which means there's more than one leek growing in the little cell there. And you can do that with quite a few veggies, things like radishes, leeks and onions. They don't mind it at all. Kohlrabi, which is a brassica. But what you really don't want to do is try and do that with things like with broccoli. So if you see here, there's actually 2 broccolis growing in this cell. Now this one's looking pretty healthy. This one's only actually got 1 leaf. Something might have happened to it. It might just be weaker and a bit of a mutant. So I am going to do something that's pretty brutal, and I'm going to chop it off. Now, I could have tried to prick that out if it was a perfect seedling, but it wasn't looking very healthy, and it's a delicious microgreen. So it seems brutal, but it's actually much better for the plants if you snip them off rather than pull them out, because then you don't damage the roots. So we're going to head outside. Hopefully it's a nice break in the rain, so follow me. So here we are at row 7. You would have seen it last week when I was preparing the soil. So it's just been resting for that time. It's had a week to sort of relax. You can just plant straight into it, but I wanted to show you the planting. So let's talk a bit about spacing. So how closely you put together your veggies is actually really, really important. You don't want to put them too close together because then they don't produce very well. But also, if you're spacing them really, really far apart, that's wasted space. You could be growing a lot more food in the square meterage you have. So I talked to a market gardener recently because I didn't think I was spacing my veggies as well as I could be, and he suggested planting them 45 centimeters apart. So that's what I'm going to do here. If you know someone that's an expert, use them. Books are great, and videos, but they tell you lots of different things. So if you find someone who's on very similar soil to you, that's growing near you basically, they're a great person to talk to. Now, in terms of actually planting, I could excavate a massive hole, but if you remember what I talked about last week, I want to disturb the soil as little as possible. So I've got my trowel here, and basically what I want to do is just make a slit in the soil. So depending on your soil type, you'll be able to do this more or less easily. It's quite moist at the moment, so quite easy just to pull away. And then I'm going to plant fairly deeply, more deeply than some people might. So it's not level with the top of the soil, it's actually a little bit lower. And one of the reasons I'm doing that is for watering purposes. So I'm kind of creating a little bit of a well around it and just gently firming it in so that the roots have good soil contact, but not really compressing it, not smushing that clay. So just again on spacing, I could have rulers out here or a measuring stick, but because this irrigation has drip lines, drip holes, 30 centimetres apart, I can sort of use those as a bit of a guide. Okay, I'm roughly in the middle of those. So roughly in the middle again would be 30 centimetres, plus another bit is 15. And it seems ridiculous to plant them this far apart when they're tiny little seedlings, but as you'll see when we go over to another row, much bigger cabbages, they get quite large, so a good idea. Now, being very gentle, don't want to damage this little plant. Tapping that one out. Come on. And using the leaves, not the stem. And popping that one in there. Now, I'm going to water these in straight away because we're going to leave this area. Normally I'd plant, a whole row as much as I wanted to before I water in, but seeing as we're going to be moving on, let's give these a bit of a drink, and I'm being really gentle. I don't want to flood this, I just want to give it enough water around its little well to really settle it in.
Sam, we have a question. Do the seedlings need to be planted right next to the dripper holes?
That's an excellent question. It depends on the time of year. So this time of year, when it is raining a fair bit and it's nowhere near as hot, I don't feel like I need to plant them right next to the holes. In summer, and even as recently as sort of 6 weeks ago, I was planting directly next to the holes, or roughly. If it's a 45 centimetre spacing and you've only got drips every 30 centimetres, sometimes you've got to do a bit of a balancing act. What you can do is not plant next to the holes and then just water them until they actually go and seek out that water that's dripping. And I'll talk about irrigation just a little bit more in a second. But let's go plant the leeks, just to give you one thing I forgot. We really like to protect our tiny little seedlings. So you might hear some people talk about hardening off, which basically means between going from a really protected environment like a greenhouse, and if you're buying seedlings, then they've been grown in a greenhouse, you actually expose them little bit by little bit to weather. So we don't have to do that because we're kind of lazy. We actually get these are old Fowler's preserving jars that we got for nothing. We actually put those over the top to create like a mini greenhouse while they settle in. So we just water and then pop these over the top. The other benefit is that a lot of things that are going to try and come and eat your plants will actually be stopped by something like this. Some things can still get under, but it does provide quite a bit of protection. So we'll leave these on for about a week and then we'll pop them off on a nice mild day. The other thing you can do is net something like these. These are brassicas, so they will get attacked by cabbage white butterflies. It's just guaranteed. So we're thinking about putting a net over this row while the seedlings are all really small. You'll see another row where we didn't net and why we're thinking about doing it now. But anyway, let's plant these leeks. We'll go over to row 5, which is my leek row. So you can see leeks here that have been planted a little while ago. I did plant these all by the drip holes because I think the last ones went in maybe 4 weeks ago, and they weren't that much bigger than this. So some people talk about letting them get to pencil thickness before planting them out. That's sort of pencil thickness. We plant them much smaller than that, and it works out fine. A lot of people use a dibber to plant leeks, and basically that's just a tapered stick. You can use an old tool handle. We used to plant leeks with that, but we found it was smushing the soil a little bit and sort of smearing the clay because we are quite heavy clay here. So now I'm just preferring to use that cut method. So again, making a pretty deep hole, and I'm going to cluster a few of these together and just pop them in there. Danny, you might want to try and get a close-up. You can see the roots quite far down. The reason we bury leeks so much is that we want to get a fair bit of white. You know, it's a more tender part of the leek. I eat the green as well. I think it's delicious. But, you know, if you can get a little bit more white, that's good. So I'm just sprinkling a little bit of soil at the base to cover the roots, but I'm not trying to backfill all the way to the top. That's going to happen naturally over time with water as the soil falls in. It's basically just so that there's as much green exposed as possible now, so it can photosynthesize and get bigger. And then later it'll get covered over, it'll go white. You know, that'll be a really good situation. So now it is raining a bit more. I'm actually going to put these leeks pretty close together. I think they might even be as close as 10 centimeters. You can see these ones growing super close together. They're very, very happy. As long as the leeks are getting the water and the nutrients they need, you know, they're more than happy. Feel free to ask any more questions if you've got them. We'll just put the rest of these in so they don't dry out.
Someone asked, will planting them together mean they won't grow as big or wide?
No. So leeks just seem to push each other out the way, which is quite fun actually. We can show you some bigger leeks. They're actually just behind me. I'll finish planting these and you can have a look. And you'll see how closely they're growing together and how well they're doing. Just plant these last ones. So as you can see, planting doesn't take a lot of time. It's probably the most fun of all the gardening tasks. And then, as always, I'm just going to water these in really gently, just into the bottom of the holes. One of the best things about leeks is that almost nothing's going to bother them now. They don't tend to get attacked by pests, and they're so hardy. You know, they grow in snow and frost. They don't need hardening off, so that's excellent. I love leeks. Such an easy one to grow. So just behind me here, we've actually got leeks that we grew in the last season, along with some chives and other things, and some of them are growing pretty close together and don't seem to be worried at all. I have actually thinned them out as time goes. That's one thing you can do, is if things are growing right up next to each other, if you pull one out, then it allows the other one to get that little bit bigger. But anyway, let's head over to the garlic. I want to show you a little bit about weeding, because that's one of the most important things to do with aftercare.
Someone asked, can you do the same thing with onions, like multi-planting, or do you have to do them individually?
No, onions are another one that you can multi-sow, and again, I recommended him last week, Charles Dowding, who's got heaps and heaps of videos on YouTube. He's a really big fan of multi-sowing onions, and the cool thing about that as well, especially if you're growing for giving to other people, or you can just grab the whole bunch and pull them up, and then, you know, chuck a rubber band or a piece of string around them. It's like ready to go, you know, 5-6 onions all sitting together. So that's really cool. Okay, weeding. Weeding's super important because weeds are basically competing with the plants that you want. They're stealing their water, they're stealing their nutrients, and probably most importantly, they're stealing their light. In particular with garlic, garlic hates competition, and so if you've got weeds growing amongst your garlic, it'll actually massively reduce your crop. Instead of getting nice, big, healthy bulbs, they'll be much, much smaller, and you know, they're taking up the same amount of space in the ground, so you might as well get the biggest bulbs you can. So I really like this tool. This is a Japanese hoe. Heirloom Harvest sell these, import them, and we've put a link in the event description for them. And I do quite like to use that, especially along the sides. You know, we've got some soursopes popping up here. That just slices off. I don't have to go very deep, and I just leave the soursopes to rot there. You see, I've got some soursopes in between. I used to get really bold and try and, like, you know, slice at them. It makes me too nervous now. I've sliced too many garlic. I've lost too many. So now I just pull them out with my fingers, and you can see we've got a little grass that's germinated over here. I pull that out as well. And I just tend to chuck them over on the paths. rather than carrying around a bucket with me. So you'll see that the weeds here are very, very small. Ideally, you don't let them get big because then they've obviously started competing and they're just harder to pull out as well. So get them when they're small, make it just like a 5-minute job you do every day, and do it as part of your observation. So that's the other big thing I want to talk about in terms of caring for your plants is observation. So let's go over to this next row, row 1, which is where we've got some much more established brassicas. In this case, I think down the end here are cauliflowers. And by observation, I don't mean just walking around your garden, I mean getting up close and actually looking at what's going on. Now, anyone can see these poor collies are getting smashed. So lots and lots of holes here. You might look and think, what could possibly be doing this? You have a whole list. If you look really closely, you can see something that's trying its best to camouflage, but once you get your eye in, it's really easy to see them. They just stick out. So these are green looper caterpillars, and they're the caterpillars of the white cabbage butterfly. It's not a moth, it's actually a butterfly, and it's not native. I wish we didn't have it because they just wreak havoc with all of your brassicas. Everything in this family, they just love to munch. So I just tend to squish them or feed them to the chooks. It seems brutal, but it's the best thing to do because otherwise they will really put a big hole in your harvest. The other thing that this could be is slugs and snails, and so I've been coming out at night with a head torch and just picking them off and chucking them away. Now, obviously the most important time to protect your seedlings is when they're really small like this, because even very small pests could actually kill this plant. Once they get a bit bigger, like this tatsoi over here, they're probably going to be okay. I'd still be pulling off caterpillars, but I'm not so worried about this one. I don't need to be as vigilant. The cool thing is about lots and lots of vegetables where you eat the leaves is that you can eat the holes. There's absolutely nothing wrong with eating that leaf that's got a hole in it. So that's a bit about weeding and a bit about pests. I will say, if you don't know what it is, like you find something, you say, that's a weird looking bug, I'm going to squish it. If you don't know what it is, don't do that, because it could actually be a beneficial insect. And those are giving you a hand, so if you're killing them, then you're not doing yourself any favours. Look up either online, post on things like Garden Share Adelaide, ask people who are in the know. There are great books, what garden pest or disease is this, and you can sort of key through and find it. The best way to encourage predators in is to actually give them something to eat. Leave some things for them to eat. Don't use chemicals which are going to wipe them out completely, because then you'll never get those beneficials coming in. Planting flowers, having other places for them to hide, having natives, all of these are really great strategies for encouraging those beneficials as well. Any more questions, Danny?
Yes. Would you plant by the moon?
Yeah. So some people really, really love lunar planting, and there are guides online that tell you if it's a good seed day or a good root day or a good fruit day. I tried to do it, but it just doesn't suit my lifestyle or the way I garden. I get fired up about planting something on a particular day because of the weather or because of my energy. So I think there is some science to it, but it's just not something that I've gotten into. Do what works for you. That's the number one rule of gardening. There's a million ideas and opinions out there. This is what works for us. You got to find what works for you. Any other questions?
Yeah. How do you stop millipedes?
Yeah. So millipedes can be a low-level problem. They will have a little munch on your leaves. I find keeping mulch away is a good strategy, because they are decomposers. They really like to eat the stuff that's rotting. So by keeping mulch away from the base of your plants, you're going to dissuade those, as well as earwigs. Those are another one that might have a little incidental munch, but they're not really the big players in terms of damaging your leaves. It's the slugs, snails, and the cabbage loopers that are really a problem. Any other?
Yeah, and keep the questions coming. Just a reiteration of keeping white cabbage butterfly off the brassicas. We are going to net. Yes,
we are sort of too late here to net these, because I don't know if you can see. I found one earlier. There are really, really tiny caterpillars that are almost invisible at this stage. And so if we put nets over that, then they'd just be getting bigger and bigger, and it's a pain for us to take off the net and then try and find them and then put the net back on. So it's best to do it from day one, where you plant a seedling and then you cover it and protect it immediately. Good question though. So
we've got more questions coming through, which is great. We've got about 5 minutes left, so we can have questions. Do you know anything about slaters?
Yeah, slaters, again, not at all a big problem. They're decomposers. Their favourite place is under rocks and in your compost. Again, keeping the mulch away, really good idea, particularly in winter. The soil just doesn't need it. If you've top dressed with compost, as I suggested last week, then that's a good way to go. If I come out when I'm looking for slugs and snails and I see slaters, sometimes I just knock them off, just to dissuade them a little bit, but I'm not out there killing them.
What kind of net do you use, and is there an alternative to nets if you can't?
Yeah, so we're going to try using fruit netting this year because we had fruit netting on our raspberries, so it's like, we've already got it, it's just sitting in a shed at the moment. Even though those holes are quite large, they can be quite large because the butterfly is never going to squeeze itself through that hole. You just have to keep it away from the leaves with some kind of propping system. Some people will use gauze or mozzie net, old mozzie net that's maybe not so good for keeping mozzies out anymore, but will dissuade the butterflies. Alternatively, you can just pick them off. That's what we've been doing out here. It's a little bit more work, but if you've got kids, that's a really good activity for them. And I find if you're out chatting to someone in the garden and you start doing something like weeding or like picking things off, then they just join you. It's a really good psychological way to get people to do work for you, is to just start doing work yourself.
Can you plant mint and coriander now? They don't seem to be surviving for those people. Yeah.
So mint and coriander, absolutely, it's a great time because both of them love moisture. So mint loves a really damp spot. This time of year it can be in full sun. Coriander, the trick is getting it to germinate. So that's one of the things that we do direct sow. So we just sort of sprinkle coriander seed around, and some of them will germinate almost immediately. Others will take weeks and weeks. It's quite a thick seed coating, I think, and so it just takes a while for them to get going. They are delicious to lots of things that like to eat them, so we just absolutely go crazy with the seeds. And depending on where you've gotten your seeds and how old they are, for cooking, you can sprinkle those around to grow new coriander. And whenever you get a coriander that's gone to seed, just sprinkle those around as much as possible.
Can you recommend any bug deterrent plants for veggie patches?
Bug deterrent plants. Some people swear by things like citronella or native lemongrass, things like that. I'm a bit suspicious that them just sitting there is not really going to deter that much. Other people say, chop and drop it. Actually cut pieces and lay them around. Again, I'm a bit suspicious. I don't know if there's been any studies. That'd be really interesting to find out. One of the things that we do is actually have a perennial plant at the end of each row. A herb plant. In this case, we've got sage here, and I think this is a pizza thyme. Oh no, this is a lemon thyme. Sometimes it's difficult to tell. And that sort of provides a bit of a hiding spot, particularly for things like ladybugs that need to overwinter somewhere. They'll actually burrow into there and find a little spot to hibernate, and then they can come out when the weather warms up again in spring. So we really like having those plants at the end of rows. It also means that the row never looks completely bare when you empty it. There's something always growing there, which is lovely. I will mention just a couple more resources that we've put links to in the event page. So Nadia's Garden, she's put out an amazing free guide, a PDF, how to grow in Adelaide, and that's got some great tips. Stephen Hopfner from Wagtail Urban Farm, fantastic local grower as well. He's got amazing tips and tricks. And then also, if you wanted to buy seeds, we use the seed collection quite a lot. They've got some more unusual varieties of things. And also Diggers has some cool stuff as well. Heirloom Harvest are brilliant local seed growers, and they're at Wollonga Farmers Market, as is Di Bickford, and she sells under Bickley Vale Farms. She's got beautiful seedlings. We don't grow all of our veggies from seed. Sometimes they fail, sometimes we forget, and so we buy seedlings from her sometimes, and they are just the best. So thanks again to our partners, NRM Board and Resilient South. thanks for joining us. And remember, this is part of a series, so we're going to be coming back and doing things like sauerkraut and sourdough bread and making wheat bags, fun stuff like that. Tomorrow, if you're around, we're doing apple juice. So yeah, feel free to join us 1 p.m. tomorrow. And happy gardening. Enjoy it. It hasn't rained. Amazing. I'll see you next time.